Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that's, well, really at the heart of how effectively you learn and perform, the concept of strategies.
That's right.
We've got a really insightful piece of research as our foundation, a 1998 article from Educational Psychology Review titled A Perspective on Strategy Research, Progress and Prospects by Alexander, Graham, and Harris.
A classic, really.
Think of this as your personal guide to understanding what a learning strategy truly is, how it differs from just having a skill, and the fascinating ways your strategic abilities grow and change over time.
Exactly. And this article, it provides a really comprehensive look back at how researchers were thinking about learning strategies up to that point, the late 90s.
Right.
And what's quite interesting, even though the word strategy had been thrown around a lot in cognitive research since like the 1970s,
Yeah, you hear it everywhere.
the authors point out that there hadn't been a huge amount of deep examination of what it actually meant. They specifically mentioned some earlier key work from '91 by Alexander, Shillert, and Hare, and another important contribution by Dole, Duffy, Roller, and Pearson that started to dig into this.
Okay.
So our mission today is to really unpack this idea for you, drawing on their work and, well, the wealth of educational research they discuss.
Okay, let's unpack this then. When we talk about a strategy for learning, what exactly are we talking about? It feels like it should be more than just, knowing how to do something.
You've absolutely hit on a crucial point there. Based on their extensive review of educational literature, Alexander, Graham, and Harris identified 6 key characteristics that really define a learning strategy. First, strategies involve procedural knowledge.
Procedural knowledge.
Okay, think of this as the how-to, the actual steps and techniques involved in accomplishing a task, as researchers like Anderson and Ryle have described. This can be very specific, like an algorithm, the step-by-step method for solving a long division problem, or maybe a distant to rate time question.
Okay, like a recipe.
Exactly. But it can also be more general, like a heuristic. Those rule-of-thumb approaches we use for more open-ended challenges, such as how to effectively summarize a complex article or really make sense of what you're reading.
So an algorithm is a bit like following that precise recipe to bake a cake, whereas a heuristic is maybe more like a general cooking technique you might use without a specific recipe in mind, like knowing how to saute vegetables.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah. And the second key attribute is that strategies are purposeful.
Purposeful.
You need to be aware of a gap, a discrepancy between your current understanding or ability and what you actually want to achieve. This awareness acts as the driving force, the catalyst, behind using a strategy.
Okay, so you see a need.
You recognize a need to learn something better or perform a task more effectively, yeah.
That makes total sense. You wouldn't intentionally use a strategy if you didn't have a specific goal in mind, right? What's the next defining feature?
The third characteristic is that strategies are effortful. They really require you to invest time and mental energy.
Ah, okay. Not passive.
Not at all. The authors contrast simply rehearsing information, just repeating it over and over in your head, with a more strategic approach, like summarizing what you've learned. Summarizing clearly demands a lot more of your cognitive resources.
Absolutely. Anyone who's tried to really condense the main points of a complicated report knows that's not a passive activity at all. It takes real brain power.
Exactly. Now, the fourth attribute is that strategies are willful or volitional.
Willful.
This emphasizes the conscious decision and action you take as a learner to address a recognized need, a point that Corno and Rohrkemper highlighted in their work.
So you have to choose to do it.
Precisely. And what's really interesting here, and maybe a bit frustrating sometimes, is that people often know they have a learning challenge, and they might even be aware of a strategy that could help, but they still don't actively choose to use it. Garner's 1990 research really brought this disconnect between awareness and action to light.
Oh, that totally resonates. I can definitely think of times when I knew a better way to study for something, but I don't know, stuck with my old, less effective habits. Laziness, maybe.
It happens to everyone. Precisely.
Okay.
The fifth attribute is that strategies are essential for academic development.
Essential. Okay, strong word.
It is. Researchers like Alexander de Sessa and Gelman and Greeno argue that you really can't achieve true competence or a deep, principled understanding in any field without developing these deliberate ways of acquiring, organizing, and using information. It's about much more than just memorizing facts.
So strategies are like the fundamental tools that allow you to build that really solid, lasting understanding of a subject, not just skate by.
Exactly. And the final attribute, number 6, is that strategies are facilitated, basically. They help you perform better.
Makes sense. They should help.
Right. The research of Bjorklund and Harrison Graham has consistently demonstrated this. We see it in how successful students tend to use more strategies and more effectively than those who struggle.
Right.
And also in how strategy training programs often lead to significant improvements in learning, as shown in the work of Graham and Harris, Bellingsar and Brown and Weinstein and Mayer.
So training works.
Often, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, as Paris and Winograd pointed out, it's not some kind of magic bullet. Strategies can actually hinder your learning if you use them inflexibly or, choose the wrong strategy for the task at hand.
Okay, so it's not just about having a bunch of strategies in your toolkit, but about knowing which tool to use when, and crucially, how to use it effectively. Okay, so we've got a good handle on the what of strategies now. Now, the article discusses different dimensions of strategies. What are the key distinctions here?
Yeah, this is where we look at how broadly a strategy can be applied. The authors describe a sort of spectrum of generality. At one end, we have general cognitive strategies.
General ones, okay.
These are the techniques that are useful across a wide range of subjects and tasks. Researchers like Alexander and Judy, Glaser, Harris, and Weinstein and Mayer have all emphasized these. Think of things like rehearsal, that simple repetition we mentioned earlier, summarizing, predicting what might come next, elaborating on ideas to connect them to what you already know.
Oh yeah, like linking it to something familiar.
Exactly. And looking for patterns in information, as described by Flavell and Garner.
Can you give us a concrete example of how you might use a general cognitive strategy in, like, everyday life?
Absolutely. Let's say you're trying to remember a new phone number. You can simply repeat it to yourself several times. That's rehearsal, right?
Yeah.
A general cognitive strategy you can use to remember all sorts of verbal information, not just phone numbers.
Got it. Simple repetition. Okay. And what's at the other end of this spectrum of generality then?
At the other end, we have domain-specific and even task-specific strategies.
Okay, more specialized.
Much more. These are more closely tied to particular subject areas or even very specific tasks. Glaser and Presley and his colleagues have done a lot of work here. Domain-specific strategies are kind of like specialized versions of those general strategies we just talked about.
How so?
Well, for example, organizing information is a general strategy, right? But in a science class, that might specifically involve creating a graph or a table to visualize data.
Right.
Whereas in a history class, organizing might mean constructing a timeline to understand a sequence of events. Both are about organizing, but they are tailored to the specific demands of the subject matter.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, the way you'd organize your thoughts for a science experiment would be quite different from how you'd organize the key events of, say, the French Revolution. What about those task-specific strategies, even narrower?
Even narrower, exactly. Task-specific strategies are even more bounded in their application. Think of mnemonics, those memory aids.
Oh, like ROIGBIV for the colors of the rainbow.
Exactly. Or every good boy does fine for the notes on the lines of a musical treble clef. That's incredibly helpful for remembering musical notes, but doesn't really apply to many other learning situations, does it?
Ah, those classic memory tricks. Right, really handy for very specific things, but not much else. So I seem to remember reading that there was some debate back in the 80s about whether general or domain-specific strategies were more important for learning. Was that a thing?
Exactly. Yeah, that was a big debate. Glaser was a strong proponent of the importance of domain-specific knowledge and strategies, really emphasizing the content, while Sternberg's work often focused more on the power of general problem-solving abilities, those transferable skills.
Okay, so who was right?
Well, the current understanding, as Alexander and Judy pointed out even back then, is that all levels of strategies, general, domain-specific, and task-specific, are actually essential for you to be a successful learner. You really need a well-rounded toolkit.
So it's not an either-or situation, but really a both hand when it comes to the types of strategies we need.
Got it. Now, the article also discusses metacognition and self-regulation as dimensions of strategies. How do these fit into the picture? They sound important.
They're extremely important
Yeah.
and often considered higher-level strategic processes. Metacognition, in simple terms, is basically thinking about your own thinking.
Thinking about thinking, okay?
Yeah. Being aware of, evaluating, and controlling your cognitive processes. Researchers like Borkowski, Carr, and Presley, as well as Brown, Armbruster, and Baker, and Garner and Alexander, have made significant contributions here. Flavell famously defined it as knowledge about cognitive matters.
Knowledge about cognitive matters.
He further broke it down into three key components. Your awareness of your own strengths and weaknesses as a learner. That's person knowledge.
Okay, like knowing I'm bad at memorizing dates.
Exactly. Then, your understanding of the demands of different learning tasks. Task knowledge?
Like knowing this test requires essays, not just multiple choice. Right. And finally, your knowledge of different strategies and when they are most effective to use. Strategy knowledge.
Okay, knowing that making flashcards works well for definitions.
Precisely.
Can we revisit our phone number example to see how metacognition might come into play there?
Absolutely. Great idea. Imagine you're trying to remember that phone number again. If you realize you generally struggle to remember strings of random digits, that's your person knowledge.
Check.
And you recognize that a phone number is a particularly arbitrary piece of information, hard to connect to anything else, that's task knowledge.
Right.
You might then consciously decide to break the number into smaller, more meaningful chunks, like the area code and then maybe two other groups, or maybe create a mental image associated with it. Because, these strategies help you remember better. That's strategy knowledge.
Oh.
That whole process of self-awareness and deliberate strategy selection, that's metacognitive behavior in action.
Okay, that makes the concept of metacognition much clearer. So it's the awareness and the conscious control part of using strategies. It's like being the manager of your own learning. Now, what about self-regulation? How does that differ? Sounds similar.
It is similar, but self-regulation builds upon metacognition and has a broader focus. While it definitely includes monitoring your cognitive performance, as researchers like Pintrich and Shunk, Zimmerman, and Wynn have explored extensively,
Okay.
it also encompasses managing your motivation, your emotions, your behavior, and even aspects of your surrounding environment, like turning off your phone to support your learning goals.
Ah, so it's bigger than just the thinking part.
Exactly. Self-regulation researchers, like the ones I just mentioned, haven't focused quite as much on the generality of cognitive strategies. Instead, they've looked more closely at specific components, like setting achievable goals, using self-talk to stay focused, come on, you can do this, monitoring your progress, evaluating your work, and even rewarding yourself for achieving milestones, whether these are applied broadly or to very specific tasks.
So, while metacognition is more about the thinking and choosing of cognitive strategies, self-regulation is more about managing the whole learning process, including staying motivated, focused, managing your environment, kind of the whole package.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Researchers like Sexton, Harris, and Graham, as well as Zimmerman and Martinez-Pons, really emphasize this broader scope. And self-regulation is particularly important for learners who experience difficulties or have learning disabilities, as the work of Barkowski, Wang, and Carr and Harris has shown.
Why, particularly for them?
Well, they often need to develop explicit skills for managing their emotions, like frustration, and their behaviors, like staying on task, in addition to their cognitive processes, just to learn effectively.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, if you're feeling frustrated or overwhelmed by a challenging task, just knowing a good summarizing strategy isn't going to be enough on its own. You need to be able to manage those feelings and maintain your focus to actually put the strategy into practice.
Precisely. Okay, finally, the authors make a really important distinction between learning strategies, which have been our main focus so far, and instructional strategies.
Okay, learning versus instructional.
Instructional strategies are the methods and techniques that teachers use to facilitate student learning. Things like think-pair-share activities, cooperative learning projects, or reciprocal teaching methods, as discussed by researchers like Brown and Planksar, Collins, Brown, and Newman, and Harris and Graham.
Right, the stuff teachers do in the classroom.
Exactly. And while these instructional strategies are absolutely crucial for creating effective learning environments, the primary focus of this deep dive, as the authors clearly state, is on the learning strategies that you, as an individual learner, can employ.
Okay, that gives us a really comprehensive overview of what learning strategies are and the different types and dimensions involved. Super helpful. Now, the article delves into a really interesting area. The distinction between strategic and skillful behavior. We often use these terms almost interchangeably, right? Like, he's a skilled reader or she used a clever strategy. But are they truly the same thing when it comes to learning?
That's a really insightful question, and yes, the authors highlight it as a key distinction.
Hmm.
While both strategic and skillful behavior involve procedural knowledge, that how-to we talked about earlier, as Alexander and his colleagues, and Dole and his team pointed out, the critical differences really lie in the automaticity of the performance than your level of awareness or intentionality as the learner.
Ah, okay.
Skills, at their core, are procedures that have become routinized through consistent practice, as the psychologist William James noted way back. You could perform them fluently and effectively with minimal conscious thought or cognitive effort.
Like riding a bike or touch typing.
Exactly. Or think of a skilled reader, effortlessly decoding words on a page. Or maybe a history enthusiast, automatically recognizing potential biases in a primary source document. Skills streamline performance, and crucially, free up your mental resources for other aspects of the task, like understanding the meaning.
So skills are like those things you can do almost on autopilot without really having to consciously think through each step.
That's an excellent way to describe it, yeah. But what happens when those automatic skills aren't sufficient for the task at hand? Maybe the text is really difficult, or the historical document is unusually subtle.
Right, when autopilot isn't enough.
That's exactly where strategic behavior comes into play. When you encounter a new or particularly challenging situation where your routine skills aren't getting the job done, you need to engage in conscious, intentional, and effortful processing. That's when you deliberately draw upon your repertoire of general, domain-specific, and task-specific strategies.
So the very same action could be considered a skill in one context and a strategy in another, depending on how automatic it is for you and how much conscious thought you're putting into it.
Precisely. A skilled reader might typically decode words automatically, that's a skill,
Hmm.
but when they encounter a very technical term they don't know, or maybe a really complex sentence structure,
Yeah.
they might consciously employ strategies like breaking down the word into its component parts or rereading the sentence carefully to figure out its meaning that shifts the process from an automatic skill to a deliberate strategy.
Okay.
Similarly, our history student might usually recognize obvious bias instinctively, that's a skill honed over time, but sometimes they'll need to consciously analyze the author's specific language choices,
Mhm.
the historical context, potential motives, to detect a more subtle form of bias. That's strategic.
Right.
The key difference isn't so much the procedure itself, but the level of automaticity and conscious control involved in that particular moment.
That's a really important distinction to make. It highlights that even experts in a field, people with lots of skills, still need to engage strategically when they encounter novel or complex challenges. It's not like strategies disappear once you're good at something.
Not at all. In fact, experts often use highly sophisticated strategies, especially for problem finding and knowledge creation.
Okay, now let's talk about how these learning strategies actually develop within us. It's not something we're simply born with, right? You don't pop out knowing how to summarize.
Absolutely not. Strategy development is a gradual process of transformation that unfolds over time, as Bjorklund has extensively described in his work. And interestingly, it's not rigidly tied to specific age milestones, but rather more closely linked to your increasing competence and experience within a particular domain of learning.
So it's more about experience than just age.
Generally, yes.
Mhm.
And the authors point to early signs of strategic behavior even in very young children. Think about a 7-month-old intentionally using a stick to move a mobile closer.
Wow, really? 7 months.
Yeah. Or an 18-month-old strategically stacking boxes to reach a desired object on a high shelf.
Those are surprisingly sophisticated and goal-directed behaviors for such young children.
They really are. And it shows that the roots of strategic thinking are there early on. Now, as you begin to learn a new subject, because so much of the information and the tasks are unfamiliar,
Right, everything's new.
you tend to rely more heavily on conscious strategic solutions, as Alexander has noted. You also initially lean on more general strategic knowledge, like simple rehearsal or rereading, because you haven't yet developed a strong repertoire of domain-specific strategies, a point that Brown and Polinsar have highlighted.
Makes sense. You use what you've got.
Exactly. However, this early use of strategies is often, frankly, inefficient, and your understanding of the subject matter might be incomplete or fragmented.
Yeah, clumsy.
Clumsy is a good word. Even when you do attempt to use domain-specific procedures, they can feel clunky and may not always be very effective. Furthermore, strategies that you learn in one specific situation often remain kind of welded or tied to that initial context and aren't easily transferred to new situations, as researchers like Bransford and his colleagues in Lave have discussed.
So when we're first starting out with a new subject, we're kind of experimenting and maybe not always very good at using learning strategies effectively. It sounds a bit trial and error.
Precisely. There's definitely an element of that.
Yeah.
But as you gain experience and your competence in a domain grows, your strategic behavior undergoes several key changes, as Alexander, Bjorklund, Glaser, and Harris and Graham have all shown through their research. First, your strategy use becomes more efficient.
More efficient, okay.
Less clunky, exactly. Those domain-specific problems that once felt novel and challenging become more routine. The strategies you use to tackle them become more practiced and automatic, requiring less of your conscious mental energy, as Anderson and Glaser have pointed out.
Right.
Some procedures even become so highly practiced that they no longer require any intentional control on your part. They become skills, as Bjorklund has noted.
That makes perfect sense. Think about learning to ride a bike initially. Every little movement and balancing act requires intense concentration, total strategy use.
Totally.
But eventually it becomes almost second nature, a skill.
Exactly. Second, your strategic behavior becomes more effective.
More effective. How?
You begin to employ more powerful and perhaps more elegant strategies, and you start to apply your existing strategic knowledge in a more intelligent way. For example, research by Ornstein and Nauhaus found that younger children might simply rehearse one item at a time when trying to remember a list,
Right, just repeating one word over and over.
whereas older children tend to use the more effective strategy of rehearsing words in meaningful clusters or groups.
Ah, chunking them together.
Right. And as Alexander and Judy have observed, more confident learners develop a better sense of when to use a strategy and which specific strategy is most appropriate for the task at hand. Better selection.
So it's not just about using strategies more often, but about choosing better strategies and using them more wisely, more sophistication.
Absolutely. Third, you become more flexible in your strategy use.
Flexible, adaptable.
Adaptable, yes. You gain the ability to modify existing strategies to suit new purposes and also to combine different strategies in novel and creative ways. Walvord and her colleagues, in their work on writing, found that more competent writers are much more likely to integrate outlining and planning with other writing strategies in a flexible and iterative way,
Iterative.
meaning they go back and forth, adapting their outline as they write, rather than sticking rigidly to it, whereas less competent writers tend to stick to a more rigid, linear outlining process plan first, then write, never revisit the plan.
That's a great example. A more flexible writer sees an outline as a tool to be adapted and changed as needed, maybe even scrapped, rather than a strict set of rules to follow blindly.
Precisely. Fourth, and this might seem counterintuitive at first, as you become more competent in a domain, you tend to become less reliant on conscious strategic solutions for common problems.
Less reliant. How does that work?
Well, as we discussed earlier, many previously challenging problem solutions become automatized as skills. You just know how to do it.
Right, the bike riding thing again.
Exactly. And you rely less on those lower-level general strategies for routine tasks, as Glazer's pointed out. However, and this is important, strategies remain absolutely crucial for tackling novel and complex problems within the domain.
Okay, so they don't disappear, they just become more focused on the hard stuff.
Right. And interestingly, as you progress towards real expertise, the role of strategic processing actually expands again, as Jai and Garner have observed, but now it's focusing more on formulating entirely new problems and generating new knowledge within the field, pushing boundaries.
So it's almost like a cycle.
Mhm.
We start by heavily relying on strategies as beginners, maybe fumbling a bit. Then we use them more selectively as we gain competence, and certain things become automatic skills. And finally, as we approach expertise, we again use strategic thinking, but in a much more sophisticated way to push the boundaries of our knowledge and creativity.
Precisely. A very nice summary of that progression. And finally, related to all this, there's often a qualitative shift in the types of strategies you commonly use.
A qualitative shift, meaning the kinds of strategies change.
Yes, as your competence grows, the importance of some lower-level strategies might decrease, while the value and frequency of using more sophisticated, deeper processing strategies tends to increase. For example, Alexander and her colleagues did a study of college students in educational psychology,
Okay.
and they showed that over the course of a semester, students shifted from relying heavily on lower-level strategies, like simply rereading lecture notes or changing their reading speed,
Yeah, common tactics.
to employing deeper processing strategies like actively creating mental images related to the concepts, or summarizing concepts in their own words, or elaborating by connecting ideas.
Ah, so moving from surface level to deeper engagement.
Exactly.
Wow. It sounds like strategy development is a really dynamic process of becoming more efficient, effective, flexible, and ultimately more.
Well, strategic in how we approach learning within a given domain. It's not static at all. Now, the article also makes a point about the individualistic nature of this development. It's not like everyone follows the exact same trajectory, right? We're not all clones.
Absolutely not. That's a crucial point. Learning and development are always a complex interplay of your individual personal characteristics, the specific task you're facing, and the context in which the learning is taking place, as Alexander, Bjorklund, and Graham and Harris have all emphasized repeatedly.
The person, the task, the context.
Right. Your unique biological predispositions, your psychological tendencies like anxiety or confidence, and your cognitive strengths and weaknesses all interact with the learning environment and the specific demands of the subject matter to shape your individual path of strategy development.
So my path might look different from yours. Very likely. Even children of the same age and general developmental level might choose to use quite different strategies when faced with the exact same problem, as Bjorklund and Presley and his colleagues have found.
Really? Same age, same problem, different strategies.
Yep. And even within your own learning, your strategic behavior can vary considerably across different subjects. You might be super strategic in math, but less so in history, and even across different tasks within the same subject, as Alexander and Bjorklund have both noted.
Can you give us an example of this kind of individual variation in how strategies develop or are used?
Sure. Graham and MacArthur's research on children who struggled with writing provides a great example. They found that even after being explicitly taught the exact same strategy for revising their written work.
Okay, everyone got the same instruction.
Right. But different children applied that strategy in very different ways. One student might focus on making both substantial changes to the content and correcting mechanical errors like spelling. Another might primarily focus only on improving the substance of their writing, ignoring the mechanics for the moment. And a third might even adapt their entire writing process, how they planned and drafted, as a result of learning this one revision strategy.
Wow, so the same lesson have very different impacts.
Exactly. The authors also use a fascinating example from outside of formal education, noting how the renowned writer Norman Mailer apparently employed different strategic approaches to his writing depending on the specific book he was working on. That highlights that even highly accomplished individuals exhibit individual and context-dependent strategic behaviors. It's not monolithic.
That really underscores the idea that developing and using learning strategies is a very personal journey. There's no single right way that fits everyone all the time. So, what are some of the key influences that shape this journey as we move from being a novice towards becoming more strategic and expert in a domain? What pushes us along?
The article emphasizes that your existing knowledge, your motivation to learn, and your developing repertoire of strategies are all deeply intertwined. They act as catalysts for each other, driving your progress, as Alexander has pointed out.
Knowledge, motivation, and strategies.
A big three.
Pretty much, yeah. Let's start with knowledge. When you're new to a subject, your understanding is often fragmented, maybe superficial, right?
Totally. Bits and pieces.
But as you gain competence, your knowledge becomes more organized, interconnected, and principled. You see the bigger picture. And this deeper knowledge, in turn, enables you to use learning strategies more efficiently and intelligently, as Alexander and her colleagues have found.
So knowing more helps you use strategies better. It does. And while a strong foundation of knowledge can sometimes reduce your need to consciously employ strategies for routine tasks because they've become skills,
Right.
it can also actually facilitate the use of more sophisticated, deeper processing strategies when you tackle complex ideas. You have more to connect new information to.
Yeah. Okay, so as you know more about a subject, you not only might rely less on basic strategies for simple tasks, but also become capable of using more advanced strategies to tackle complex ideas. It enables higher level thinking.
Precisely. There was a study by Many and her colleagues that illustrated this beautifully with the example of a student named Victoria. Her evolving understanding of what research truly meant, moving beyond just finding facts to understanding interpretation and argument,
Yeah.
directly influenced the sophistication of the synthesizing strategies she used when working with multiple sources. As her knowledge of research deepened, so too did her strategic approach to integrating information. It became more nuanced.
That's a really powerful illustration of how our understanding of a subject directly shapes the strategies we can effectively use. It's not just about having the strategy, but having the knowledge base to apply it well. Okay, what about motivation? How does that fit into this picture of strategy development? We all know motivation is important.
Hugely important. Motivation and learning have a reciprocal and dynamic relationship, as numerous researchers like Alexander and Murphy, Corno and Rohrkemper, and Dweck and Leggett have shown. It goes both ways.
How so?
Well, motivation obviously fuels your engagement in learning. You try harder if you care, but experiencing increased competence and success, which often comes from using effective strategies, in turn boosts your motivation. You feel good, you want to do more.
The success breeds motivation loop.
Exactly. And because strategic processing often requires conscious effort and is directed towards specific goals, changes in your levels and types of motivation can significantly influence how you develop and apply learning strategies, as Wigfield and Eccles have pointed out. If you're not motivated, you're probably not going to put in the strategic effort.
Right.
Research on learned helplessness, as discussed by Harder, also clearly demonstrates this. Negative self-perceptions and a lack of belief in your ability to succeed can seriously hinder strategic action, even if you actually possess the necessary knowledge about effective strategies. You just don't try.
So, if you don't believe you're capable of succeeding at a task, or if you're simply not invested in it, you're less likely to put in the effort required for strategic thinking, even if you technically know what strategies you could use. That's kind of sad.
It is, and it's a real barrier for some learners. Garner's work emphasized that your learning strategies are closely tied to your personal learning goals and your sense of agency, your belief that you can actually make a difference in your learning.
Right.
The example of the student Robert, who prioritized gathering information based on his personal interest rather than following a more systematic research strategy, clearly shows how motivation can drive your strategic choices, sometimes even overriding instructions.
He followed his interest.
He did. Conversely, as Alexander and her colleagues and Graham and Harris have found, making progress in your strategic knowledge and abilities, learning new ways to learn, can also lead to higher levels of motivation. Yeah, it feels empowering.
That positive feedback loop again.
Exactly. And perhaps not surprisingly, learning strategies that prove to be successful are much more likely to be retained and used again in the future, as noted by Scardamalia and Bereiter and Zimmerman and Schunk. We stick with what works.
Makes sense. Okay, so it's clear that knowledge and motivation are huge. What are some other personal factors beyond those two that influence how our strategies develop?
Well, mindfulness is a really crucial factor, as emphasized by researchers like Garner, Graham, and Harris, and Salomon and Globerson.
Mindfulness, like being present.
Sort of, yeah. Being consciously aware and attentive. You might have learned a variety of effective strategies, maybe in a workshop or a class, but you often fail to apply them in new situations simply because you're not being mindful or consciously aware of the demands of the current task and the potential applicability of those strategies you learned before.
Operating on autopilot again.
Exactly. Transferring strategic knowledge from one context to another relies heavily on recognizing cues of similarity between the old situation and the new one. If you're operating on autopilot, just going through the motions, you're less likely to notice those crucial cues.
So just knowing about a strategy doesn't automatically guarantee you'll use it appropriately. You have to be paying attention.
Right. Sometimes you need to consciously override ingrained, less effective habits. Furthermore, a lack of mindful engagement can also prevent you from truly understanding the value and effectiveness of a particular strategy. You might use it poorly and think, well, that didn't work, without realizing you didn't apply it mindfully.
So you need to be actively engaged in thinking about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how it's working in order to effectively apply and benefit from your learned strategies.
Precisely. When you approach a task with more mindfulness, you actively analyze the situation. You consider different strategic solutions that might be appropriate, and then you critically evaluate the outcomes of the strategy you choose, as Alexander and Salomon and Gloverson have pointed out. This deeper level of engagement can help you to see the value of strategies in a new light and increase their usefulness for you.
Okay, mindfulness is key. What about more basic cognitive processes, like our working memory capacity or how fast we process things? Do they also play a role in how our strategies develop?
Absolutely. The automaticity of your lower-level skills, how effortlessly you can do basic things, can significantly influence your capacity to engage in higher-level strategic processes.
How does that work?
We'll take writing, for example, as Graham and Harris and McCutcheon have discussed. Your ability to recognize words effortlessly or to transcribe your thoughts fluently onto paper or screen.
Like how fast you can type or write?
Exactly. Those basic skills consume cognitive resources. For young or struggling writers, the sheer effort involved in the physical act of writing, or even just spelling words correctly, can be so demanding on their limited cognitive resources.
Yeah, it takes all their focus.
Right. So they might adopt less strategic approaches to composition, such as simply writing down whatever comes to mind in the order it occurs to them, sometimes called knowledge telling, just to manage the cognitive load. They don't have the mental bandwidth left for complex planning or revising strategies.
Okay, so the basic mechanics get in the way of higher level strategy use?
They can, yes. And even after these basic skills become more automatic, that less strategic knowledge-telling approach might persist if they haven't explicitly developed and practiced more sophisticated planning and revising strategies along the way. The habit sticks.
It sounds like sometimes our cognitive resources are limited, And we have to make choices, maybe unconsciously, about where to focus our mental energy. If basics take up too much, there's less left for strategy.
Exactly. And finally, individual differences in areas like general aptitude, the depth of your prior knowledge, and even preferred learning styles can interact with the effectiveness of different methods of strategy instruction, as Snow and his colleagues have noted.
So instruction isn't one size fits all either.
Definitely not. For example, Presley's research on the use of imagery as a memory strategy found that it was generally more effective for children who happen to have a greater capacity in their short-term memory.
Ah, so your individual cognitive profile matters.
It does. This highlights the fact that the benefits of strategy instruction might not be evenly distributed across all learners, and some individuals might require more tailored support, maybe more practice, or different types of strategies than others, as Sexton and his colleagues have pointed out.
So it's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to strategy development or instruction. We really need to take into account individual strengths, weaknesses, knowledge, motivation, even basic cognitive capacity. Okay, let's shift gears slightly now and talk about how the characteristics of the task itself influence strategy development. It's not just about the learner's internal factors, is it? The assignment matters.
Not at all. The specific nature of the problems and tasks you encounter plays a really significant role in shaping your strategy development, as the authors emphasize. Domain differences are a key factor here.
Domain differences like math versus history again.
Exactly. Alexander and Stewart have highlighted that different academic disciplines or domains often present fundamentally different types of problem structures. For instance, in mathematics, you often encounter well-structured problems that have clear, specific algorithmic solutions. There's usually a right answer and a set procedure. Whereas in a field like literary analysis, or maybe philosophy, you're more likely to face ill-structured problems, open-ended questions, with multiple valid interpretations that require the use of more flexible heuristic strategies like interpretation, argumentation, considering different perspectives.
Okay.
This inherent nature of the domain influences the types of strategies that are most commonly used, most valued, and ultimately the ones that get developed and refined by learners in that field.
So the kinds of strategies you develop and use in a very structured field like mathematics might be quite different from the strategies you develop in a more interpretive field like literature or art history, simply because the problems are different.
Precisely. And other factors like time constraints and the mode of response that's required for a task also play a role.
Time constraints, like having only an hour for an essay.
Exactly. Strategic processing planning, monitoring, evaluating, revising often requires time. If you feel under significant time pressure, you might be more likely to revert to less strategic, more automatic, maybe even less effective behaviors just to get something done.
Panic mode sets in.
Kind of, yeah. The study by Many and her colleagues showed this in the context of students adapting their research strategies, maybe cutting corners as a deadline approached.
Right, and mode of response, like writing versus multiple choice.
Or even just say whether you're writing by hand or using a word processor. That seemingly simple difference can affect your planning strategies and your approach to revision, as researchers like Haas and Halpern and Liggett have found.
That's interesting. How so?
Well, some research suggests people might plan more globally when using a word processor because it's easier to rearrange things, whereas handwriting might encourage more local sentence-level planning because physical revision is harder.
Huh. I can definitely imagine how having to physically write out your ideas might lead you to plan more carefully before you start, just to avoid messy crossing out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Finally, and this links back to motivation, the value you place on the task is crucial.
How much you care about it.
Exactly. If you don't find an assignment or learning activity interesting, relevant, or meaningful, you're likely to be less motivated to engage in that effortful strategic thinking we talked about, as Graham and Harris have noted. Why bother if you don't care?
Makes sense.
The increasing emphasis in education on creating authentic learning tasks, tasks that mirror real-world problems or have personal relevance, is partly an attempt to address this, to make learning more inherently valuable and engaging for students.
Right, make it feel like it matters.
And your underlying learning goals also matter hugely. Are you focused on mastery and deep understanding, or just getting a good grade?
Learning goals versus performance goals.
Right. A focus on mastery and really learning the material, as Alexander and Murphy found, is linked to greater strategic effort. You use strategies to help you understand. whereas a primary focus on avoiding work or simply trying to perform well for external evaluation like getting the A can actually hinder deep strategic processing, as Mies and Holt have pointed out. You might opt for superficial strategies that get the grade but don't lead to real learning.
That's a key distinction.
Interestingly, though, even if a task lacks external appeal, maybe it's a required course you don't love, your personal interest in the specific topic can sometimes override that lack of external motivation and lead to greater strategic engagement anyway, as Garner and his colleagues found. Curiosity can be powerful.
So making learning feel relevant and engaging, either through the task design or by tapping into personal interests, is a really key factor in fostering the development and use of strategic thinking. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the learning environment itself, the context. Our surroundings and the support we receive surely influence how we develop strategies, right?
Yeah.
It's not all internal.
Without a doubt, contextual influences, particularly the instructional support provided by teachers, mentors, even peers, are absolutely vital, as Graham and Harris and Presley and his colleagues have consistently emphasized.
So good teaching matters for strategy development.
Immensely. This includes explicitly teaching and monitoring effective learning strategies, showing students how it's done, not just telling them. It involves providing opportunities for guided practice with feedback and helping students to develop a sense of ownership over their strategic learning, as researchers like Rosenshine, Harris, and Graham, and Meichenbaum have argued.
Ownership, feeling like it's your strategy.
Exactly. Creating a classroom or learning environment where the use of strategies is not just taught, but also actively required, valued, and rewarded is crucial, as Garner has pointed out. It needs to be part of the culture.
Right, not just a one-off lesson.
And the principle of learning by doing, famously articulated by Dewey and further explored by Zimmerman and Chunk, requires providing real opportunities for students to exercise strategic control over their own learning processes. They need the chance to try things out, make choices, maybe even fail sometimes, and learn from it.
So giving students some autonomy.
Yes. Even something like giving students more voice and choice in their learning activities, such as selecting their own writing topics or choosing how to present their work, as Graham and Harris have suggested, can foster this sense of ownership and purpose that drives strategic engagement.
So it's not just about passively receiving information about strategies, but about actively creating a learning environment that encourages and supports students to experiment with, use, reflect on, and ultimately develop those strategies for themselves.
Exactly. And collaborative learning environments where students have opportunities to engage in problem finding and problem solving alongside their peers can also powerfully stimulate strategy development, as Bereiter and Scardomalia and McCutcheon have found.
Learning from each other.
Yes. The Vygotskian perspective on learning, as highlighted by Salomon and Globerson, underscores the value of collaborating with more knowledgeable peers or teachers from whom you can observe and internalize new strategies and ways of thinking. It happens in that social interaction.
The zone of proximal development idea.
Precisely. Even the careful formation of problem-solving groups, making sure there's a good mix of skills and perspectives, as suggested by Aronson and Brown and Campione, can be a highly effective instructional strategy for fostering strategic growth.
It sounds like a supportive, engaging, collaborative, and explicit learning environment is absolutely essential for nurturing strategic learners. It takes a village, so to speak.
It really does. Individual effort is key, but the context provides the fertile ground.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the world of learning strategies. As we start to wrap up our conversation, what were some of the big remaining questions and future directions in strategy research that the authors of this 1998 article pointed towards? Where did they see the field needing to go next?
They highlighted several really important areas for future investigation back then, and many are still relevant today. One key area was the need for more longitudinal studies.
Following people over time.
Exactly. Tracking learners over extended periods to truly understand the developmental trajectories of strategic processing. Much of the understanding at that point was based on cross-sectional studies comparing different age groups at one point in time, which offer only a snapshot. Following the same learners as they grow and develop could provide much richer insights into how their strategic abilities actually evolve and change.
Right, see the actual journey.
Another fundamental question they raised is whether there's an inherent disposition towards strategic processing. Is it a relatively stable personality trait like being generally conscientious, or is it more of a dynamic state that's heavily influenced by the specific situation and context?
Like, are some people just naturally more strategic thinkers than others?
That's the question. And it has significant implications for how we think about individual differences in strategic learning and whether strategic thinking is something that can be readily taught to everyone to the same degree.
Those are really fundamental questions about the very nature of strategic thinking itself. What else was on their research radar back in '98?
Well, given the time when this article was written, the late 90s, they also specifically emphasized the growing need to understand strategic processing in hypermedia environments.
Ah, the internet was really taking off then.
Exactly. With the rapid rise of nonlinear information technologies like the World Wide Web and interactive software, they recognize the critical importance of investigating what it means to be a strategic learner in these increasingly complex digital spaces.
Yeah.
How do you navigate, evaluate, and synthesize information effectively online? That was becoming a huge question.
And still is.
Absolutely. They also pointed to the ongoing challenge of developing more effective measurement tools that can truly capture the multifaceted nature of strategic processing in real-world learning settings. Relying solely on learners' verbal reports about their strategy use, just asking them what they did, has inherent limitations. People aren't always aware, or they might say what they think you want to hear.
Right, self-report isn't always accurate.
So finding more direct, maybe observational or performance-based ways to assess strategic thinking reliably remained a key priority.
It sounds like even though we'd learned a tremendous amount about learning strategies by 1998, there were still many exciting and important avenues for future research to explore.
Absolutely. The authors concluded their perspective by stressing the continued fundamental importance of intentional problem solving, which is really what strategic thinking is about, and the enduring value of reinvesting in both strategy research and effective strategy instruction. They felt that comprehensive reviews like theirs and ongoing dialogues within the educational research community could serve as important catalysts for that renewed focus.
Well, this has certainly been a really valuable exploration for me. It's definitely given me a lot to think about regarding the strategies I use or maybe don't use in my own learning and performance. Thank you so much for guiding us through this fascinating research.
My pleasure. It's a topic that really has significant implications for pretty much everyone who wants to learn more effectively, whether in school, at work, or just in life.
Absolutely. And for you, our listener, as you reflect on our conversation today, maybe consider this. In what specific areas of your own life and learning could a more intentional, a more mindful, and perhaps a more strategic approach potentially make a significant difference in your outcomes? Where could you move from autopilot to deliberate action? Perhaps that's a question worth diving into on your own. Join us next time for another deep dive into the world of knowledge and learning.